Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
So in The Descent of Man, Darwin spends a lot of time puzzling about human morality. He's got to, because if he's going to explain everything by natural selection and competition, he's got to explain why we are often so virtuous, cooperative, helpful. So he generates all kinds of clever reasons, and one of the ones that he generates is when he's trying to figure out why we do so many things that seem to be good not for ourselves but for our groups. He asks us to imagine a situation in which two groups of early humans are competing with each other. They're near each other, they're competing. And he says, if the one tribe included a great number of courageous, sympathetic, and faithful members who were always ready to aid and defend each other, this tribe would succeed better and conquer the other. Selfish and contentious people will not cohere, and without coherence, nothing can be effected. What Darwin is really suggesting here is that natural selection can occur at multiple levels at the same time. So here's the way to think about that. Here are a bunch of guys on a crew team, and like any group of guys, they're competing with each other. Only a few of them can make it into the lead boat, but at the same time that they're competing with each other within the boat, their boat is competing with other boats. And as long as you have competition across boats like that, well, these guys in the first boat are all in the same boat. And they can only win if they all pull together as a team. So if we suppose that life is sort of like a crew race where everyone gets killed at the end if they're in the bottom portion, we can see how these traits for selfishness might not make it so much into the next generations. For the next 100 years, scientists are quite comfortable saying, oh, well, animals have all these virtues, birds may restrain their breeding for the good of the group. Or they may not graze too much because that would lead to starvation for everyone else. And you often even get this awful phrase, for the good of the species. And it should really never be said when talking about evolution and animal behavior. Evolution doesn't care about the good of the species. Two very, very important books in our intellectual history, George Williams' Adaptation and Natural Selection and Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene. Williams in this book describes how he was listening to a lecture by a termite specialist and how everything is explained by the good of the group, which for termites works. That makes sense. They're all siblings. But then he applies it to other species, and they die to make room for the next generation, which is just crazy talk from a Darwinian perspective of natural selection. He says, yes, it is possible that evolution could create group-level adaptations for groups to succeed, but then he examines them carefully in lots of species, and he says, group-related adaptations do not, in fact, exist. They're possible in theory, but you don't find them in the natural world, he says. Morality is an accidental capability produced in its boundless stupidity by a biological process that is normally opposed to the expression of such a capability. Richard Dawkins takes a similar view. Let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish. Now, during this period, the science of religion takes off. The idea here is that, well, once we've established that groups are not real, groups are not evolutionary entities, everything must be explained by looking at individuals competing with individuals, then there's really only one clear way forward, which is to say that religion is not an adaptation for either individuals or groups. Rather, what it is a parasitic meme complex. And the reason why this parasitic meme complex is so effective is that our minds are full of modules that evolved for other purposes, such as a gullible belief module. Just believe whatever people in your culture tell you to believe. So these parasitic memes exploit us, and they make us do things that are bad for us, but good for the religion. So suicide bombing, for example. Obviously, there could be no gene for suicide bombing. It's rather bad for your evolutionary fitness. It even has spread. There are even some women who have been suicide bombers, even some women with children. David Sloan Wilson wrote a really interesting book in 2002 called Darwin's Cathedral, in which he takes Emil Durkheim's perspective on religion. Durkheim, the great sociologist, defined religion as a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, which unite into one single moral community called a church, all those who adhere to them. So he joins Durkheim and Darwin together and says, look, this fits like lock and key. Darwin's multi-level selection and Durkheim's groupish function of religion. A wonderful idea that we all got from Dawkins is the idea that the world is full of replicators. These replicators especially are DNA. There are other forms, but the most studied ones, the most important ones, are DNA molecules. How do DNA molecules copy themselves? By making animals and plants. So as Dawkins put it, a chicken is a chicken gene's way of making more chicken genes. Now let's try to run it through groups. Chickens don't live alone, they live in groups. So were flocks of chickens vehicles that carried chicken genes on to the next generation? Well, let's apply Darwin's test. If the one flock included a great number of courageous, sympathetic, and faithful chickens who were always ready to aid and defend each other, this flock would succeed better and conquer the other. Well, it's an empirical question. Do chicken flocks work this way? And the empirical answer is no, they do not. Let's say this is a human gene. And a human gene replicates itself by making a human. But now let's think about this. Do human genes travel around to any extent in tribes, in groups of people that work together, that come together, and then compete with other tribes? And I submit that the answer is obviously yes. Our behavior is much like that of other primates until about 600,000 or 700,000 years ago. We domesticate fire, we get hearths, we get division of labor between the sexes, we get groups cooperating to hunt large game. Once you get that, of course, you're going to get competition between groups for territory at very least. So now imagine that human groups in Africa before the dispersion are all living in this way. And might it be the case that some tribes do it better than others? Because of cultural inventions, for sure. But might it also be the case that certain genetic mutations make some people more tribal? Their minds are just better at making something sacred, circling around it, trusting each other, basically being fit for gang warfare, let us say. So I think when you look at it this way, it's rather obvious that human genes have come down to us not just because some people beat out their neighbors, but because some groups beat out other groups. If this is the case, if we did evolve by multi-level selection, then we would expect to find some groupish instincts, some things buried in the human mind, part of human nature, that makes us groupish. Monuments to heroes, we designate battlefields and other significant lands as sacred, we won't allow development on them. So we do all these things that are hard to explain as adaptations that help one individual beat out the guy next to him or the woman next to him. They don't make any sense for that. But boy, do they work well if you think about groups competing with groups. And this has led me to formulate what I'm calling the Hive psychology hypothesis. That is, that human nature is 90% chimp and 10% bee. In recent times, by recent I mean sometime in the last 500,000 years, and especially the last 100,000 years, we were shaped by some level of group versus group competition, just as beehives are shaped by group versus group competition. And this gives us a kind of a hive-ish, groupish overlay that has not been appreciated by the social sciences or evolutionary biology. That's my big message today. This is the big new idea that I think is going to transform the way we think about human nature. We're 10% bee, and that has not been appreciated. Religions do, in fact, solve free rider problems, and they do, in fact, help groups cohere. Religions ask a lot of people. Some sacrifices are relatively trivial. Here's a group of Amish women who can't fully enjoy a day at the beach because of the dress codes of their religion. So these are relatively small sacrifices, you might say. But of course, religions demand much greater sacrifices as well. Self-flagellation, people put their lives at risk. They sometimes give their lives. Very, very costly sacrifices. How could that be? How could that be adaptive? The best research on this was done by an anthropologist, Richard SOSUS. What SOSUS did was he collected data, reports on 200 communes, that is, intentional communities in America in the 19th century, groups that left the corrupt morals of the city, let's say, and tried to start their own community with good values that they wanted. And about half of them were secular, mostly socialist, half were religious. And what this graph shows, this is how long the communes lasted in years, and most of them were over within 10 years. Most of them faded away or broke up within 10 years. Most of the secular groups asked very little, but none of them lasted very long. The secular communes faded out very quickly. The black bars are the religious communes. What this shows you is that there were 4 that asked very little, and like their secular counterparts, they died out very quickly. But there were 10 communes in his data set that demanded between 3 and 5 different kinds of sacrifice, and they lasted longer. 4 religious communities the more they demand of you, the more effective the moral community is at maintaining itself and lasting 60 years, on average 65 years. Quite a feat. So the take-home message from this, I think, is that gods are like maypoles. I myself am an atheist. I do not believe that there are gods in the world, but gods are very, very common human inventions. Are they just parasitic meme complexes that spread because they help themselves while hurting us? I don't think so. I think that gods are like maypoles, that is, they are human inventions that then enable people to circle around. And when we circle around something with other people, we then trust them, and we create a moral community with them. Going forward, I'd like to replace the Williams quote with this. Morality and religiosity are adaptations produced biological process, multi-level selection, that always yields a balance of cooperative and competitive impulses. And let's replace the Dawkins quote with this. Let us embrace a realistic picture of human nature and then maximize the benefits of our hivishness while minimizing its negative externalities. Perhaps not an inspiring word to end on, but I hope the idea is to some extent uplifting and hopeful.
One of the interesting ideas in sociology in the last few decades has been the notion of reflexivity. So the idea that one of the things that is distinctive about modern human beings is this capacity to reflect upon themselves and reflect upon their own lives. Now, you introduced in the happiness hypothesis the idea of the rider and the elephant, which I adapted to be a rider and elephant in a jungle, the jungle being social norms, but you refer to that as well.
Yes.
Do you think, in line with sociological thinking, that our reflexivity, and indeed a reflexivity which also includes an understanding of our cognitive frailties, may in time change the balance between the rider and the elephant?
Absolutely. So I'm coming to you from what I think is the first reflexively designed nation on Earth, in which the founding fathers of the United States looked at England and took many great things from you, and others we said no thank you. And it was very much a self-conscious effort in how should we govern ourselves. And the genius of the American founding fathers was that they really were aware of human frailty. They were wary of democracy. They saw that you had to have some sort of popular control, but they knew that when you open up to mass democracy, the people tend to vote for lower taxes and more services. America began an experiment in thinking about human nature and then trying to design institutions. And this is a big part of modernity. As we understand ourselves better, we're able to replace the sort of the natural institutions with some artificial institutions, some of which bomb terribly, and that's what the French Revolution was all about. Others work brilliantly, and I think the Scottish Enlightenment and then the American experiment were examples of how it can be done in a better way.
You argue in the book around kind of 6 fundamental kind of moral intuitions or categories of intuition, and you say that, as it were, social conservatives kind of touch all 6 of these, and liberals only really touch 3 of them, and that's one of the reasons why conservatives tend to win political arguments over liberals. I felt you were being a little bit soft on conservatives, simply in the sense that one of the other characteristics of conservatives, whilst responding to all these different moral traditions, is there's a greater scope for contradiction. And one of the contradictions that conservatives have got themselves into in Britain and America in the last 15 or 20 years is, on the one hand, the support for social conservatism as you describe it, and on the other hand, the support for free markets on the other. And this is proven to be quite, and this isn't something which you explore in the book. I'm just interested in, that,
Yes.
in your reflections
That's
on
right.
that.
So politics, as we experience it, is coalition building. And politics makes strange bedfellows. So in America, we've got this weird paradox that the Republican Party is the home of the Christian right, which wants, at the extreme, almost a form of sort of Christian Sharia. I mean, it wants government to enforce certain values. That's as anti-libertarian as can be. But the Republican Party also includes the libertarians. It's not because they're all conservative. It's because they all hate the welfare state. So they're united by what they see as liberal excess in the 1960s and 70s, liberal hubris in designing all these institutions that, for the social conservatives, rot moral fiber, and to the libertarians, stamp out individual liberty and stamp out negative liberty, replace it with positive liberty. So it's not that conservatism has a contradiction. It's that the conservative wing in both countries combines groups that have different moral foundations.
And you don't see that that leads to inevitable tensions and possibly leads to politics which is focused on antagonism towards the other, because the internal debate is a little bit too painful to have.
Well, that's right, but there's a wonderful Arab expression, me against my brother, me and my brother against our cousin, me, my brother, and cousin against the stranger. And right now, the American Republican Party, they are currently engaging in me against my brother. The Republicans are usually much better at hanging together and attacking the liberals. But for the last 3 or 4 months, they've been really going at it with each other. But it's all in terms of who's more socially conservative. As Mitt Romney said, misspeaking, he said, "I'm a severe conservative," a bizarre phrase, but he was trying to show, I'm conservative, like social. I know he's not a social conservative at heart, I don't think. But that was an internal debate, and now that he's about to win that, now he'll be moving to the center and being more receptive to some of the libertarian elements. They're going to get it together to fight the Democrats in the fall.
We had an event here a few weeks ago where I had a fascinating exchange with a philosopher, public intellectual, Alain de Botton, and he'd written a book about religion, how great religion is, but he's not religious. Both he and I had the same experience of going out with a rabbi and saying to the rabbi, we're quite interested in becoming Jewish. Is that possible? And the rabbi explaining that whilst if you're Jewish, you're born Jewish, or you become Jewish because of faith, you can then lose your faith and stay Jewish. You can't start. You can't join a religion without having the proper supernatural bit. Right. Can religion survive without the supernatural belief? Right. So more and more people are making arguments for the social value of religion, but in the end we rely on a group of people who we don't have much sympathy for, who genuinely do have supernatural beliefs to keep the tradition going.
That's right. So my view is that the key innovation for us wasn't supernatural beliefs, it was sacralization. Once we develop the ability to treat things as though they are infinitely valuable and circle around them, that's the key thing. That's what you need for social cohesion. Do you need gods? Not necessarily. People can sacralize helping the poor. They can sacralize justice. They can sacralize freedom. As long as you have people able to sacralize things and then be sort of irrational about it, you can get a lot of these social benefits. Now, then you also have the competition and the rivalry. People on the left tend to be very wary of groupishness because they equate groupishness with racism. But one of the big findings is that when you divide people up into groups and teams and they have all these identities, you get a big boost on in-group love and trust. And you get only the slightest bump of out-group hate. It's often zero. So like intramural sports, it can be very positive. People love their teammates, but they don't hate the other side. Now, somehow in Britain, you've invented a really toxic form of sport and soccer hooliganism. That's bad news. And now we've got that in the American Congress. But groupishness, so groupishness has to be managed, and there are toxic forms and constructive forms.